Hello, my loves. Today we're going to look at some more Reddit stories, and if you've enjoyed a Reddit story, why don't you consider hitting the subscribe button? Maybe that's the notification bell too, and let's start with today's story. Me, a man, once birthed thousands of babies, and then murdered them all. I was reminded this week of something that happened about 15 years ago. I must have told my wife the story before, because the other day when I began to reminisce she loudly repeated "no, no, no, no" until I shut up. So here I am, to tell you guys instead. I live in a large coastal city in the subtropical region of Australia, and it was a humid and stinking hot summer as it is every year. One night, my friend and I decided to escape the oppressive heat of the suburbs and drive to the bay to get some of the evening sea breeze, and maybe catch a fish or two for dinner. I cast my fishing line off a rock wall by a creek mouth, and my friend clambered around on the rocks with her knife eating oysters. There wasn't much of a breeze after all, but there was some moonlight and everything was peaceful on the slack tide. The bay here isn't one of those beautiful sandy beaches Australia is well known for. Sheltered by islands and with a large river feeding the bay with sediment, it's a region of mudflats, mangroves, and coastal wetlands. And quite naturally, billions upon billions of walking, crawling, flying, biting, blood-sucking insects. I'd applied insect repellent that night, but a cloud of mosquitoes and midges hung around anyway. They will prod and probe, looking for any chink in your armor. Any exposed flesh missed by the repellent is fair game to these tiny mongrels. I was getting bitten a little bit but nothing unbearable, and then I felt a sharp pain between my shoulder blades. That's no mosquito. I swatted at my back, but the bite was right in that place that's hardest to reach, between the shoulders. The bastard had bitten me through my shirt, so I tugged at it and I felt a tiny weight lifted from my back. It must have been there for a while without me noticing, drinking my precious blood. I spun around, and in the moonlight caught a glimpse of some winged monstrosity lazily flying away. The pain from the bite was already fading, so I was relieved that I hadn't been stung by something venomous. There are some big blood-sucking flies around sometimes, so figured it was one of those. I didn't give it any more thought and went back to fishing. After some time, my friend dropped me home empty-handed. I both love and hate fishing. A few days later, another hot and humid day, I woke up badly hungover at around 10 a.m., and it was already over 30 degrees Celsius. Having slept in just my undies with no covers, I was sweaty and sticky. Head pounding, blurry vision. Was it possible to feel worse than this? Yes, it was. I was covered in spider webs. My half-dead brain instantly fired up all the neurons it could muster. There might be a spider on me, on my back. Fuck. I could feel webs on my back and shoulders. I'd heard the myths about people eating spiders in their sleep. Was this the evidence? Had I snatched up the spider in my sleep and gobbled it down? Or was it still on me? I was too afraid to reach back there and check. The thought of touching a large Australian spider with my bare hands was too much for me. But I could feel the webs, man. A lot of webs. I got up and went to the living room to seek help from my housemate. Dude, I can feel spider webs on me. I think I might have a spider on my back. I turned around for him to check. He took a quick glance. No, there's no spider. Then he did a double take. He took a step closer and examined me. After a pause, he bluntly stated what he saw. Bullshit, I laughed. I was relieved that there wasn't a spider, and what he had said was well in line with the pranks and wind-ups common in our household. Go look in the mirror then, he said, wide-eyed. Okay then. I went into the bathroom to check, as the spiderweb feeling was intensifying since I had gotten out of bed and started moving around. I was half convinced by now that my hungover brain was playing tricks on me, and my housemate was definitely full of shit. With some difficulty, I was able to turn my head around enough to see my back in the bathroom mirror. I had a red volcano between my shoulder blades, like a large pimple or maybe an ingrown hair that had popped and left a crater. Weird place to get one, I thought. The skin all over the top half of my back and shoulders had a gray tinge, most intensely near the volcano and radiating out to thinner gray near my arms. The area extended down to about halfway down my back. To my hungover eyes, the gray skin seemed to be subtly, gently rippling and moving. But I could feel the rippling. It felt like spider webs on my skin. Jesus, how much had I had to drink? I took a step backward towards the mirror, so I could get clearer view of the gray skin on my shoulder. Looking as closely as I could, that's when I saw them. My housemate hadn't been winding me up after all. The gray skin was tiny larvae. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands maybe. All wriggling and squirming away from their birthplace, the red volcano, my very own flesh. Their tiny crawling bodies felt so similar to having spider webs on your skin. I had forgotten about the insect bite from a few nights before, but now it all made sense. The insect hadn't bitten me, it had violated me in another way altogether, pierced my skin and used me to host its brood. It must have been there for quite some time laying. Horror. In that moment, a sizable portion of my brain went to some faraway happy place, and what was left was sufficient enough to remove my undies and amble over to the shower. Having cold showers during summer here is normal, and probably the reason the eggs in my flesh had survived so long, but despite the intense heat of the day I cranked the shower to full hot. I just stood silently with my back to scalding stream for as long as I could stand it, making sure every single last one of those tiny gray freaks had been blasted to hell. And that's the story. I was fishing the other day and a March fly bit me through my shirt and reminded me of the time I birthed and then murdered thousands of baby monsters. My wife didn't want to hear about it again, so thanks for reading. Story, My Dead Friend is Haunting Me. In 2020, I, 18-year-old, became best friends with a girl who I had gone to school with for years. We were both starting our sophomore year in high school at the time, and we became really close because we had a lot of online classes together that year. We shared music with each other, traded funny stories, and talked about our dreams for the future. Out of all the people I had ever met, she was the most excited to grow up. She couldn't wait to get into her dream college, to start dating, to lose her virginity, to become a doctor and help people. It was all she could ever talk about, resenting the 16-year-old body and responsibilities that kept her from being at that point in her life. In early 2022, I had a falling out with her over a petty argument. We were both mad at each other and pretty much stopped talking. Later that year, right before our senior year would have started, she drowned. I wasn't invited to the funeral, and no one even knew she and I had been such close friends since we only ever spent time together online during the pandemic, texting and calling each other for hours at a time. She only had a few friends, and I didn't know any of them very well. Her parents were in an ugly legal battle over the nature of her death, and our high school pretended like she never existed. Back in August of 2023, almost exactly a year after her death, I was taking a shower in my family home's bathroom. For context, the bathroom has a light switch. It doesn't turn on or off automatically. When I was in the shower, I started thinking about her. The more I thought about her, the sadder I got, and all of a sudden, the lights in the bathroom turned off. I froze, looking around. No one had entered the bathroom and turned off the lights, and it wasn't a power outage because I could see the light from our hallway through the bottom crack of the door as well as the light from my brother's electric toothbrush charger still on inside the bathroom. After about a minute, the lights turned back on. A couple days later, I was thinking about her again driving home from work in the early afternoon. When I got home, the door to my room was closed, which was weird because I only ever close it when I'm inside, and I always leave it open when I leave. Between the time I had left and gone to work, no one else had been home, too, so it couldn't have been one of them. Even weirder, when I opened the door, all the lights in my room were on. My house always has all the windows and blinds open, so there's never a need to turn on the lights when it was light out. None of the other lights in the house were on. Barely anyone I've talked to seemed to know who she is, to the point where sometimes I wondered if I imagined her. But every time I open Discord, I see her profile on my friends list still idling, a year and a half after her death. I don't think her parents ever touched her computer after she died, so Discord has been open all this time. Every time I see her there, it's like a massive weight on my heart. I think about her every day, and I regret that we never made up. I wonder if she died thinking I hated her. Whether she's haunting me or not, I can't stop thinking about her. Not a day goes by where I don't wonder how she felt when she died, what she would be doing now, and if she can still see me. Does she resent me? Did she die resenting me? I guess I'll never know, but I hope that I keep remembering her forever so that no one forgets her. I hope that if she is haunting me or watching me and messing with me, she knows I'm sorry. Story: My encounter with a black-eyed child. I know what you might be thinking, she's just trying to get likes. Well, you're wrong. This is true, and it happened to me yesterday night. It was a little past midnight, so I guess it was this night, and I had woken up to a banging sound on my door. But before we get to the scary stuff, let me tell you what black-eyed children are. Black-eyed children are children with pale skin and black eyes. Not just the pupil that is black, their eyes are all black, no whites or anything. Just black. They go to houses or cars and bang on their windows or doors. When you open it, they will ask, "Can I come in?" But, whatever you do, don't let them come in. They usually appear in a group of 2 at night so no one can see their eyes. They will look like completely normal innocent children who are lost and need to come in. If you let them in, then you will experience bad luck for the rest of your life, and there is absolutely no way of getting rid of it. So anyway, back to the story. I woke up to the sound of loud banging on my door. My parents were out voting, and my sister was still asleep. I went downstairs quietly so I wouldn't wake my sister up. I had cameras, but I decided not to look at them. When I looked through the little peeping hole on the door, I saw children. They didn't look quite as normal though. The little boy, around 8 years old, had these weird shoes and outfit that someone in like the 40s would wear, or just in the 1900s. The point is he dressed old-fashioned. The girl, around 6, did not look so better. She had this haircut that a woman would wear in the 90s and an outfit that a woman would wear in the 70s. Besides that, they looked perfectly normal. Are you lost? I asked. Our parents will be here soon. They both said in unison, "Do you need anything? Can we come in?" Right away I knew that something was off about these kids. Not just the fact that they were dressed weirdly, but the fact that their voices were off. They had voices that number 8-year-old or 6-year-old should have. I suddenly felt dizzy and I knew that something demonic was in these kids. If your parents are almost here, then can't you just wait out here? I asked. It was a perfectly sweet neighborhood and not a robbery or anything had ever went on. I never even ever saw a shady person walk around here. Can we come in? They asked once more. But, this time, they weren't asking. They were starting to get angry. "No, you may not." I yelled. I know this sounds bad that I am saying that a little kid that's lost can't come in my house, but there was something off about these kids. That yell woke up my sister and she turned on the light, which helped me see that these kids had black eyes. I screamed and shut the door in their face. My sister asked what was going on and who was that and why I yelled. I told her to just go to bed and don't worry about it. She did as I asked. The kids eventually left, but they did do some damage to my house when I shut the door. They ripped some plants and they cracked the window. Later that night, I did some research on them and I found out that they can only come into your house if they get permission. I also found out that it's the same with demons. Like if you summon them and play spiritual games and stuff. If you moved into a house and they were already there, then that's because someone else previously allowed them in or the place was abandoned. There is a slight chance they will come back soon and I'll be ready. When the kids left, they went into a black car with 2 tall dudes in suits. Just remember, if you ever see a kid with black eyes and pale skin coming towards your house or car, don't let them in. Story: The Void in Purity. I sat in the waiting room, bored out of my mind. The magazine I was reading had lost my interest. "Emily Thompson, you're up." the doctor said, stepping into the waiting room. A lady stood up and followed the doctor to another room. When I entered the hospital, she was the only other person in the waiting room, so I knew I was next up. I looked up at the TV, still on the news. Since I had arrived, it was just boring celebrity news, nothing important. But now it was showing interesting things. Serial killer caught in France, found guilty of 8 acts of murder. It showed his mugshot, with a dark shade of gray next to it. "That's his blood purity?" said the man sitting next to me. "Jesus, that's really dark. That's what killing 8 people does to you," I said. It felt like me and the man were about to start a long conversation, but before it could get any further, "Jake Anderson," the doctor said, peeking into the waiting room. I stood up and walked with the doctor. After only a few minutes, the blood donation was ready to begin. I looked over at the bag filling with my blood, and the doctor seemed impressed. "Your blood is very pure," he said. "You must be a very good person." "Well, thank you," I said, "but isn't this a normal purity?" The doctor looked at the bag again. The blood was almost completely white, with only a tiny bit of darkness. "Every single sin you commit makes your blood a little less pure," he said. "It's incredibly impressive to have blood this pure in your 30s. After only a few more minutes, I left the hospital. I checked my phone to see a message from my wife. "Tell me when you're on your way back, so I know when to start on dinner," she said. Of course, I responded, telling her I was going home now. I reminisced about our first date. I still vividly remembered her dark hair and crimson-red dress. Soon later, I arrived home. As I walked through the door, I was hit by a delicious smell. But it was also very noisy. My 2 kids were running around and causing chaos. My wife was trying to juggle between cooking dinner and trying to make the kids behave. I walked into the kitchen while she was cooking. She was so focused that she didn't even notice me. I snuck behind her and wrapped my arms around her. "Olivia," I said, with a flirtatious voice. "Jake," she responded with a sigh of relief. "How did the donation go?" she said. "It went well," I responded vaguely. The look in Olivia's eyes told me I had to say more. The doctor was really impressed by my blood purity. "That's wonderful," she said. "You know, I still haven't seen your blood purity," I said with a curious tone. Yeah, I know," Olivia said with a slightly annoyed tone. "I was a huge bully back in high school, so I'm a little ashamed of my blood purity." Olivia got back to cutting vegetables. I decided to drop the subject, knowing it was really sensitive for her. But before I could say any more, there was a loud crash sound. I looked over to see my children had knocked over an expensive vase, and it shattered. But as I turned towards the commotion, I suddenly heard another loud sound, a high-pitched cry. The sudden commotion startled Olivia, and the tip of her middle finger had slipped right where the knife was cutting. I quickly grabbed a towel to help, but I saw a horrible sight, one that made me jump back in fear. Olivia's blood was pitch black, having absolutely no reflection, no glimpse of light, just pure darkness. Anything it touched looked like it disappeared. I stood there, staring in shock. The killer in France who had murdered 8 people didn't even have blood that dark. What the fuck did she do? I felt like I was in some sort of hypnosis, but I was suddenly snapped out of it with a sudden flash of light. A bit of blood had fallen off of the knife, revealing its shiny silver. I suddenly grabbed my kids and ran to the car. I didn't have time to explain the situation before running off. As I drove away, I could hear screams of despair and anguish coming from the house, from Olivia. My kids screamed in fear, not knowing what was going on. Did they even see Olivia's blood? No, I don't think they had any idea. After what felt like an eternity of driving, I stopped. I broke down crying. What should I do? I can't go back there with that sociopath. But can I really abandon everything I had? What will I tell my kids? My parents? What about the police? She has clearly done something horrible and unforgivable, but I don't know what. Shit, 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 shit. I'm muttering to myself. What do I do? What can I do? Am I truly helpless? Story, Tongues, a horror story. It was already 2 years ago. I still remember that ghastly night. I was arriving home in my car. I went to park it and I saw a person sitting on the bench of my parents' house front yard. I went there and talked to him. Asked who he was. He just contemplated me with the most horrifying stare for what felt like a solid minute. I was in shock. I saw he had a hand in his pocket and his menacingly gaze made me realize I could get hurt if I stayed there. I went home, got to my room and looked at him through the blinds in my window. He wouldn't move. I was thinking of calling the police, but I didn't want to wake up my parents. I became paranoid at this point and couldn't go to sleep, had the need to be looking through the blinds at this mysterious character. It was already 3 a.m. and the man didn't move an inch. I just noticed that he moved once to smoke a cigarette. I was getting very tired and eventually blacked out. I woke up to a loud slam, like one of the doors was closed violently. I immediately got up and went to my window. To my surprise, the man wasn't there anymore. This made me freak out. I grabbed my flashlight and went searching room by room, from my bedroom to the living room, next the bathroom, the kitchen, the basement. When I got to the basement, after I went down the stairs, the door behind me was slammed shut. I got startled and ran up the stairs, tried to open the door but it wouldn't budge. I banged at the door in the expectation of my parents listening and coming down from their room to help me get out of the basement. This was to no avail. I sat on the floor and waited for someone to help me get out of there. 4 a.m., I woke up, had blacked out once again. Went to the door again to bang it to make someone come help me. I tried to turn the knob and miraculously the door opened. I was so relieved, I wondered how and why the door got locked in the first place. Went to check my parents' room, to see if they were okay since they didn't hear my loud banging. I entered their room. When I saw the mess that was my parents' room, I almost vomited, dropped to my knees and got paralyzed. They were both dead. In the walls was written with their blood, "Now they won't be talking anymore." I approached them and noticed their tongues were missing and their cheeks were cut ear to ear, like a big smile. I called the cops to come to my parents' house as soon as possible since there had been a dual homicide. The cops were suspecting it was me who did the act, but I assured them I was locked by an unknown cause in the basement. They made a team come get my parents' corpses. They were in shock since they had never seen someone do to their faces what this maniac did. I didn't know at the time that this man was the one responsible for locking me in the basement and then murdering both of my parents. How did I come to discover it? Well, the work the police were doing was taking a lot of time. I was feeling desperate to find the one responsible for that atrocity. I am a big fan of cosplaying, yet I don't cosplay myself. I like to see others doing it, also dressing up with original masks and costumes. There was a convention in my town, one about costumes and that kind of stuff. This year I made a mask just to get in the spirit the day of the convention. At the event I saw many awesome masks and costumes, but one caught my eye. It was one that had a mask made of leather, had some spikes on top, and had below each eye a tongue, 2 very realistic tongues. I followed that guy around the convention. There was something bugging me about this fellow. When he went out of the building where the event was taking place to smoke a cigarette, he took off his mask. I got shocked. It was the same man that was sitting in the bench of my parents' house front yard. I started connecting the pieces and it all started to make sense. Only thing that was bugging me now is that I can't accuse this man just because of this coincidence. He noticed I was looking at him and approached me. He said, "Do I know you?" I said maybe. We started chatting. Eventually he gave me his phone number before we left the event. He was a kind person. I don't see why I feared him before. Yet the idea that he might have to do with the death of my parents is still bugging me. We hang out for some days until he starts acting a bit weird. He invites me more than usual to go to his house and have dinner or lunch with him. He makes excellent food, so I don't refuse his invites. Funny thing about his food is that it tastes and smells a bit like almonds always. I kind of enjoyed it. I didn't know I was falling into a trap. One day I feel that is very hard to breathe, like, I breathed in the air, but it felt like I wasn't getting any oxygen out of it. I instantly phoned emergency services and explained how I was feeling. They sent right away an ambulance to my house. When they got there I was seizing on the floor. I went to the hospital and they administered medication to stop the seizures and make me be able to breathe again. They ran some blood tests and as it turns out I was secretly being poisoned. It finally made sense. I told the police that that man was slowly poisoning me. The police interrogated him and as it turns out both the already running investigation to find my parents' murder and now the investigation to find out who poisoned me traced all back to that man. The police also found the mask he took the event, ran some tests on the tongues of the mask and found out that the DNA of those tongues are both from my mother and my father. He was arrested and sent to jail. I don't know how much time he's going to spend there. I just hope that if he comes out, he never hurts anyone ever again. I'm still traumatized to this day by what happened and what I saw. Story: Two Little Girls. Springfield, Ohio, August of 1992. I was an 8-year-old that particular summer. My parents only recently started letting me go outside by myself and I was taking full advantage, but I had rules to follow, or my rights would be immediately revoked. For one, I couldn't leave my family's property. We kids had a large backyard with 2 outdoor playsets with slides and swings, so entertainment wasn't an issue, even if I had to keep it contained to the yard. Mom said it was for our own protection. She said that strangers can't be trusted, so we had to stay in the backyard, and never play in front or by the side of the road where we could easily be snatched. I didn't always obey this, but I never got caught either. This changed quickly one wet, balmy summer afternoon when my mom got word that 2 little girls about my age were missing. They had last been seen at the bakery just down the street from our house while buying sweets, their bikes discarded by the side of the road as if the girls were snatched. Or so that's what my mother told me. After a search, the girls, Free Morrow and Martha Leach, aged 11 and 12, were found dead in a gruesome, horrible fashion. I won't go into it here because the awful things they did to those girls isn't the point of this story. However, the shit I'm not talking about here is easily found online with just a quick search. Just know though, that the details are fucked up and it's not for the faint of heart. The parents of Springfield changed that day. All of my newly given freedoms were revoked. After all, the killer, or killers, were still at large. For all my mom knew, it could have been one of our neighbors. She didn't trust anyone anymore. I didn't understand it at the time, but as a parent now, I fully get it. If I were my mom, I would have locked my children down, as well. What else could she have done? There were so few options available. Who else was going to protect us if not our own parents? Everyone else was too busy trying to figure out who the murderer was. I frankly didn't care at the time who killed them. I only cared that they were dead and not coming back. I didn't know Martha very well, but I was pretty familiar with Free. The girls were a bit older than me, and we didn't share any classes, but I knew Free most through a summer gym program we both attended a month or so earlier. My brain couldn't wrap around it. I kept hearing about the horrible details of their deaths, of the terrible state that the killers left them in, of facts I wasn't mentally prepared for, but had to hear anyway. The news left few details out in those days, and what I didn't fully understand at the beginning of a school day, I was well educated in the schoolyard by the time I got home in the afternoon. 8-year-olds have no business hearing about the cruel ways their playmates' corpses were desecrated, but there I was. I heard the funeral was a real shit show, but I obviously wasn't there for that. My mom had a thing about me and funerals. She didn't think I was ready to go to any until I was well into my teens, and even then, was overprotective in the extreme when I finally went to my first one with her. I thought she was being extra back then, and I was mostly right, but now as an adult, I really do see where she was coming from a lot more than I used to. That said, to be honest, I think going to the funerals might have actually also been beneficial for me, all things considered. I've never been able to fully process their deaths, so maybe being able to say goodbye would have helped, but I have no way of knowing for sure. What I do know was that my mom was sure that she made the right decision when she heard that there were fights and family feuding allegedly taking place during the viewing and burial, but of course, I have no way of knowing if that's true or rumor. Small towns are sadly like that. Folks who weren't even there will claim anything they can to make themselves look more interesting. Meanwhile, some of us truly wish they could have attended, if anything, just for the closure. I didn't even get closure when they caught the killers. I'm not going to name them here, nor give them attention. They don't deserve it. All you need to know is there was a group of middle-aged to old men led by one of their gang of peers. The bastards tried to molest the girls, and when they fought back, they didn't just hurt the girls. They brutalized and destroyed them. There was no excuse for the monstrousness of killing anyone, let alone 2 little girls. There was nothing they could have done to deserve that. I didn't care about the reasons given for the murders. I didn't care what the murderers had to say at the trial. Their confessions meant less than nothing to me. All I cared about was that my friends were dead, and knowing the horrible details weren't going to bring them back. Frankly, hearing the killer's excuses was an exercise in self-harm. One that I refused to subject myself to again. Though I did try to read a book on the murders once, but I never got to finish it. There's actually a really crazy and ironic reason why, too. Fast forward to Christmas of 2005. I was a new mother to a sweet little baby girl, and times were hard. Homelessness was new to me, but I wasn't wearing it well. A local church was offering a free turkey feast and gifts for children at a holiday party, and my friend had invited my daughter, now son, and I to attend as well, despite not being members of the church. Of course, I jumped at the chance, and we all went together, her and her kids, and me and mine. It was lovely at first. My kid got to sit on Santa's lap and received a cute teddy bear and some candy. Then we had the feast, but I ended up realizing my allergen was in every dish, so I pulled out a book to read while I waited for my family to finish eating. I was reading a book written about the murders, which also happened to be in the town it happened in. To be fair, I should have known better, but how was I to guess that I would be sitting at the table of someone directly related to the case? Springfield is a small town, but I never guessed that small. As I was reading, I noticed a guy staring at me. Then my friend told me to put the book away and wouldn't tell me why, but I did as I was told. I still didn't know why she was acting that way while we were leaving after the party, and was alone for a moment in the parking lot having a cigarette before we left when a middle-aged man walked up to me. I said hello, and he responded with, "I bet you want to know what I know about those girls, don't you?" This threw me through a loop. I was like, WTF? Before I could really speak to him, though, my friend grabbed me and my kid and dragged us back to her car, telling us to get in as quickly as possible. Only when we were pulling out did I finally realize exactly what had happened back there. Mrs. J, my friend and driver, told me that was the brother of the head of that killer gang of middle-aged to old men. She asked me what he was saying to me, and when I told her, her face turned white with fear. Needless to say, I wasn't invited back to that church. I never finished the book. It felt weird after that particular encounter. Years passed, and I had almost forgotten about this event. That is until I was at the city library one afternoon before closing time and was gathering my things to leave. I saw the brother of the head murderer and immediately recognized him. There was no mistaking this man. He had a look about him that was hard to forget. Still, I was convinced that he'd never remember me. Not in a million years. That is, until the guy ran up to me, his face glowing with recollection. It was clear he knew exactly who I was and that he wanted to continue with the conversation we were having years before. He looked excited to see me. After a quick greeting, I told him that I had to get going, but he followed me out the door and all the way to the bus stop. I waited there for the bus, listening to his constant reassurance that he didn't know anything and was passed for being a suspect on account of his innocence. It was, quite frankly, a redneck murder version of Forrest Gump as this strange man blathered on and on about his life, his brother, and how the crime affected his life on that random bus stop bench. The whole exchange was strange in the extreme, but I was patient and polite throughout. Not only to be respectful of another human being, but also, I didn't know this guy. I had no reason to believe I was safe. After all, his brother was literally the most notorious murderer in the entire city. And then it hit me. There would be no way I could get off at my usual stop, because then he'd know where I lived at the time. I didn't know what to do, but I felt extremely uncomfortable. This man would not stop talking. I don't even remember all of what was said years later, but I just know I was unnerved and desperately wanted the social exchange to end as soon as possible. To my horror, it didn't. He followed me to the bus stop where I was to make my transfer to get home. However, when I said my goodbyes as I got on, he got on as well and said he was heading my way. When asked where that would be, he couldn't give me an answer. This is when I was forthcoming with him and said he was making me uncomfortable. I politely and softly explained that I didn't want to talk anymore and would like some quiet time now. Then, I got off a few blocks before my usual stop, and instead of heading home, I walked to the fire station on that route and rang the doorbell. When I turned around to see where he went, the strange man was all the way across the other side of the street as if to avoid me. The fire department was kind and had someone escort me home safely. Never saw him again. Story: Doctor didn't believe me. After reading several medical horror stories on here, it's no small wonder I hate going for anything medical. I thought I'd like to share my story. My experience is small potatoes compared to the rest, but here goes. Around late March of 2017, my right wrist was feeling particularly sore for several days. I bought a wrist brace and wore it during work, because at the time I had a job that required a lot of heavy lifting, upwards of 60 pounds. I favored my right wrist, overcompensating by using my left hand to bear the brunt of the weight whenever I could. My right wrist eventually healed over the course of a month or so. My self-diagnosis was that it was tendinitis. Unfortunately, the exertion on my left for the prolonged period caused severe tendinitis in my left wrist. In early May, I noticed the first symptoms. Again, I bought a wrist brace and lessened the load. Unlike with my right, my left was not improving. It worsened to the point that I had very limited movement of my wrist. Any accidental pressure or bumping of two of the tendons in my wrist, the ones leading up the thumb, resulted in terrible pain. By mid-July, knowing that my wrist should not still be in so much pain, I finally went to urgent care. The doctor examined my wrist and sent me on my way with a low-grade prescription painkiller. I took most of that medication over the course of the next 2 weeks and it did nothing. Finding that the treatment I was given had been useless, I didn't feel confident seeking further treatment. Even though my wrist was in pain, this was mostly typical if I moved, bent my wrist or accidentally bumped it. For nearly 3 more months I dealt with it. By October, my wrist had gradually worsened that it was constantly sore, at best, or leaving me in excruciating pain with tears rolling down my face and unable to use my left hand for up to an hour. In fact, my wrist felt as though it had locked up. I could barely flex my wrist at all by this point. I was barely using my left hand at all anyway, just to avoid causing pain. Finally, I booked an appointment with the local poor man's clinic that I was registered at the time. I go in for my appointment and after 20 minutes of waiting in the exam room, a doctor finally comes in. I explain to her my symptoms and for how long, telling her specifically that I physically cannot flex my wrist beyond a small degree and that attempting to do so causes tremendous pain. I also told her of my failed previous treatment. Her response? "You're just babying it," she says. Then, without hesitation, and as if to prove her point, she grabs my left arm in one hand and my left hand in her other, and rapidly torqued my wrist in a few directions before I yanked my wrist out of her grasp. Cradling my wounded appendage and with tears streaming down my face, she looked at me with an "oh shit" expression and told me very hurriedly that she is going to prescribe to me a muscle relaxer and a stronger pain reliever. I left the clinic and headed to the nearby pharmacy to get my prescriptions. While I'm waiting for them to be filled, still very sore from her manhandling, I kept thinking over what had just happened. Why didn't she believe me at first? Why had she been so aggressive to prove that my symptoms were nothing? Then it occurred to me that she likely suspected me of simply making up my injury in order to score some painkillers. My instant reaction to her examination made her realize very quickly how wrong she was. Over the next few days, I took both medications. Despite the relief from the pain, they left me feeling violently ill. After 4 days, I stopped taking them completely. Yes, I 100% wanted painkillers for my alleged addiction. Surprisingly, this doctor called me 2 days after I had stopped taking the meds to follow up with me. I admitted to her that I had stopped and why. She then prescribed to me an anti-nausea medication and told me to resume the other meds. I did as I was told. The pain subsided, though not completely, and my wrist remained stiff. That is, until nearly 2 weeks later. With the pain no longer at the forefront of my mind, I just happened to flex my wrist a little bit. I felt and heard a loud snap in my wrist. It didn't hurt at all, but there was a definite change for the better. It was as if 60% of the pressure in my wrist was suddenly gone and I had reclaimed some of my flexibility. I felt a great deal of emotional relief. A few days and a second snap later resulted in my complete recovery. Unfortunately, this experience has forever left me distrustful of the US healthcare system. I am wary of the day that I will have to rely on it. Story: Firehouse First Horror Story. In the desolate wilderness of northern Alaska, an old firehouse stood abandoned, its once vibrant facade now crumbling and overgrown. Locals whispered tales of hauntings, stories of eerie cries echoing through the desolate halls and sightings of a sinister figure lurking in the shadows. As a family road trip wound its way through the remote region, a seemingly crazed man stumbled into their path. His eyes were wild, his voice hoarse with fear. He warned them of the horrors that dwelled within the abandoned firehouse, of creatures that roamed the surrounding forest. Unfazed, the family dismissed the man's ramblings as the delusions of a madman. The father, determined to prove him wrong, ventured towards the abandoned building. As he approached, the air grew thick with a sense of dread. The firehouse loomed like a cursed monolith, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Ignoring the ominous signs, he cautiously stepped inside. Darkness enveloped him as he explored the desolate interior. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty halls, amplifying their own fear. Suddenly, a faint glow illuminated the far corner of the room. Drawing closer, they beheld a horrifying sight. A grotesque, shadowy figure emerged from the shadows, its form contorted and twisted. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly glow, and its long, sharp claws scraped against the floor. The father gasped in terror as the figure slowly turned towards them. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. A guttural growl escaped its throat, sending shivers down their spines. Frozen in place, he watched in horror as the figure advanced towards him, its eyes fixed on his neck. In that moment, they realized the truth in the madman's words. The abandoned firehouse was not haunted by mere ghosts, but by something far more sinister. As the figure drew closer, its form shimmered and transformed. It became a grotesque caricature of a woman, her body draped in a tattered wedding dress. Her eyes were filled with an ancient rage, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. The Pock Lady, as the locals called her, was the mistress of the forest's demons. With a flick of her wrist, she summoned a horde of creatures that lunged at the father. Amidst the chaos and terror, the family fled the cursed firehouse, their screams echoing through the desolate wilderness. As he stumbled back to their car, they could hear the laughter of the Pock Lady echoing behind them. The sound of her cruel mirth haunted their nightmares for years to come, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurked in the shadows of the abandoned firehouse. Story: First Horror Story. Hope you like it. Set in the sun-setting town Salem, Ally, a curious toddler is hanging out with the friendly neighbors in the cozy, warmly lit kitchen. The aroma of freshly baked cookies fills the air, adding to the pleasant ambience. However, something feels slightly off, creating a subtle unease that lingers in the background. Alexis, Ally's mom, with her gentle smile, goes outside for a breath of fresh air and takes a leisurely stroll in the yard. As we all get distracted by the laughter and chatter, Alexis remains in the yard, and suddenly, an eerie feeling creeps over me, making me open a window and call her name. To my surprise, a distant, unfamiliar voice from the neighbor's house starts yelling Alexis's name, jolting us with its volume and urgency. It echoes through the tranquil evening, sending shivers down our spines. Alexis eventually returns inside, but her behavior becomes oddly robotic and distant, almost as if she's in a trance. As darkness falls, the town's atmosphere becomes mysterious and intriguing. The warm hues of the setting sun give way to the cooler, darker tones of dusk. The air carries a gentle, cool breeze that rustles the leaves on the trees, creating a soothing melody. The distant sounds of crickets and frogs serenade us, their rhythmic calls adding to the tranquility. I notice a faint, mysterious glow surrounding Alexis in the yard, casting an otherworldly aura around her small form. Her movements appear ethereal and disconnected from reality, further adding to the unsettling scene. The situation becomes more mysterious and alarming as the darkness envelopes the town. Eerie sounds echo in the distance, and multiple voices call out Alexis's name, making us all fear something supernatural might be at play. The calls are a strange mixture of echoes and reverberations, creating an almost haunting effect that lingers in the air. Despite our fear, we decide to stick together and confront the unknown. Inside the house, strange occurrences intensify, with flickering lights casting dancing shadows on the walls, adding to the unease. The mysteriously turned-on TV displays distorted images and symbols, accompanied by an unsettling, static noise. We attempt a protective ritual to help Alexis, our voices rising and falling in a harmonic rhythm, but the tension in the house rises with every chant. The sound of our collective breaths becomes synchronized, matching the beating of our hearts, both resolute and apprehensive. As the ritual reaches its peak, the room trembles, and the candle's gentle flickering intensifies, casting a mesmerizing glow that illuminates the room with a soft, warm light. The scent of the candle's wax mingles with the lingering aroma of cookies, creating a unique and surreal olfactory experience. We face a palpable sense of danger, but as suddenly as it began, everything stops. The room falls into silence, broken only by our heavy breathing. The glow around Alexis disappears like a fading dream, leaving us in awe and wonder. With relief, we see her come back to her senses, unaware of what just transpired. Her eyes, previously distant and glazed, now sparkle with innocence and curiosity, as if nothing unusual happened. From that unsettling night onwards, our bond as neighbors grows stronger, as we remain vigilant in protecting each other from the mysterious forces that may lurk in the shadows of Salem. The town's secrets continue to puzzle us, and we now keep a watchful eye on the setting sun, knowing that darkness can awaken strange occurrences. Story: My mentally disabled brother spent 3 days in the house with my mother's dead body. He says something inhuman slunk through the house at night. I moved away from my hometown a few years ago. My father had committed suicide when I was a small boy, going out to the barn and shooting himself in the face with a shotgun. I barely remember him still. The only thing that stays with me from that day was my mother's agonized, racking sobs when she found his mutilated body. Sometimes, during nightmares late at night, I still hear those same screams, repeating over and over like a skipping record. My little brother, Charlie, was born with Down syndrome. My mother took care of Charlie by herself since I moved away. I rarely talked to my family, something I feel increasingly guilty about looking back. Unbeknownst to me, my mother had a worsening addiction to pills and alcohol. To this day, I don't know if she intended to kill herself or not. But, after examining her corpse, the medical examiner concluded that she had a lethal combination of benzos, morphine and vodka in her system. When they found her body rotting in the summer heat in her bedroom 3 days later, they said she had one eye half open, her arms still outstretched towards the telephone, as if trying to call for help even in death. The police ended up finding my number a few days later. I lived over 5 hours away, but when I heard Charlie was being kept at the police station, I immediately took the day off of work and headed back towards my hometown of Frost Hollow. I remember driving through the rural town, a place of rolling hills and thick, dark forests, thinking how dead and empty the whole area looked. A lot of the houses that had been there when I was younger had since been demolished or lay barren, dilapidated and rotting. The police station in the center of town seemed to be one of the few places still open. I looked at the shuttered windows lining both sides of Main Street, seeing one out-of-business sign after another. On the bright side, however, there were plenty of parking spots along the cracked, empty streets. I got out of the car, seeing a feral, mange-covered dog ripping through bags of garbage in a nearby alleyway. The sickly sweet smell of decaying trash filled the air, thick and cloying. I entered the glass doors of the police station, finding an old crone pecking at a keyboard behind the front desk. She looked like a twisted dwarf, her eyes magnified to giant orbs behind her glasses. She looked up at me with a pale, bloodless face. "Yes," she said in an annoyed voice. "I'm here to pick up Charlie Benton," I said. The old woman looked behind her, where a tanned woman in a police officer's uniform was leaning against a rusted metal cabinet, looking through a file. "Sergeant Alvarez deals with that," the old woman spat, looking back at her computer. The police officer sighed, looking up at me with humorless eyes. A few moments later, she circled around, coming out the tinted black glass door around the side. The slow, erratic typing of the old woman continued ringing out like the ticking of a failing heart. Sergeant Alvarez had wide, almond-shaped eyes and jet black hair pulled back in a ponytail. She did not look happy to see me. "You're Dennis?" she asked. I nodded, pulling out my license. She inspected it closely before handing it back to me. "We found your brother in quite a state. He was covered in blood, naked from the waist up, wandering through people's backyards at night. When the police found him, at first he was unresponsive, as if he were sleepwalking or something. His eyes were open, but he was not talking and appeared to be looking at things only he could see. After about 30 seconds of this, they said he appeared to wake up, though he still wasn't giving coherent answers at first. He just kept saying, 'She was walking, she was walking.' Eventually, after a lot of trying, they were able to ask him about why he was wandering at night and why he was covered in injuries and blood. 'Your brother said something kept hurting him in the house at night and that he had to get out. He had marks on his body,' Sergeant Alvarez said, her eyes suspicious. Intelligence gleamed behind them. The strangest thing. It looked like someone had burned hand marks into his back and shoulders. I found this information disturbing on some instinctive, primal level, but I didn't know why. Who could have done that? I asked, confused. She shrugged. "Charlie couldn't tell us," she said. "Your mother had been dead for 3 days by that point, and the wounds on Charlie's body were fresh. Do you know if there was anyone else who regularly visited or lived in the house with them?" I shook my head. "My mother had no friends," I said. "She was practically a hermit. She used to just stare out the window for hours when I lived there like a zombie. No one ever came to visit her." The black doors swung open again, and Charlie stood there next to a muscular police officer. Charlie's face had his typical vacant stare. Charlie appeared in his mid-20s, a sweaty, lumpy mass of a human being wearing a tight pinky and the brain t-shirt. His enormous belly hung over his belt, his shirt seemingly always pulled up to expose a few inches of naked flesh. He had confused, mud-brown eyes that rarely focused on anything for longer than a few seconds. But there were other times Charlie seemed to have an almost photographic memory, repeating entire conversations in his strange, droning monotone even months after they had taken place. "She is dead," he said, his muddy brown eyes unfocused. "She is dead. She was walking." I squinted at him, feeling cold dread dripping down my heart. "Charlie, buddy, it's okay now," I said, taking a step towards him. He looked up abruptly, seeming to just now realize that I was there. "Dennis," he screamed, his enormous belly jiggling as he ran forward. He wrapped his thick arms around me, his face filled with an innocent, childlike excitement. He lifted me off the ground. A breathy exhalation of fetid breath hit me directly in my face. I grunted as he squeezed the air out of my lungs. Charlie was immensely strong and often didn't realize his own strength. "You're crushing me, buddy," I grunted in a small, crushed voice. Charlie dropped me back down on the ground. I looked closer at him, seeing healing, sickly wounds peeking above the neckline of his t-shirt. A rainbow of black, purple, and blue marks hung there, formed in the shape of long, twisted fingers. The worst of them had drops of pus falling from the burnt craters in the center. I wondered how many more lay hidden beneath his clothes. Sergeant Alvarez gave me her card, telling me to call her if I found out any more information about the case or if Charlie remembered anything or was able to give more information in the future. I wondered who could have possibly been hurting Charlie. It made me feel sick and angry, thinking of someone following him around, scaring him and attacking him during the night. Charlie already hated and feared the dark as it was, adding another layer of cruelty to the disturbing case. He had feared it ever since he was a small boy. I walked him out of the police station, buckling him into the passenger seat of the car. As I sat down in the driver's seat, he looked over at me. Sweat glistened on his upper lip, and his goofy bowl cut of a haircut was sticking up in random spots. "Dennis, I saw her," Charlie said in his flat monotone. "She was walking. At night, I heard her feet. In the dark, I heard her feet." "Who was Buddy?" I asked. "Who did that to you? Did someone hurt you during the nighttime?" He nodded. A single tear fell from his squinty eyes, dripping down his round face. "It wasn't Mom?" He shook his head in response. His lips started quivering. He leaned close to me, whispering in a hoarse, terror-stricken voice. "The bone-face woman," he hissed, breaking down in tears. I had contacted a team to remove the soiled items in the master bedroom after receiving a call from the police. The team told me it would be a fairly easy job, and that I would be able to stay in the house later that night. With no other living family except Charlie, I would undoubtedly inherit it anyway, though I had absolutely no intention of keeping it. I wanted to sell it as soon as possible, but I would have to go through everything and decide what, if anything, I wanted to keep. All of Charlie's stuff was also still in the house, which I knew we would need to go through and package regardless. It was a Friday, and I had the weekend off work. My plan was to finish moving everything out of my mother's house that weekend. Charlie and I pulled into the sprawling property that night, turning onto the flat, dirt driveway towards the old colonial. Sharp stones crunched rhythmically under the tires. I took in the sight, the large windows and wrap-around porch of the dark purple house. I saw my childhood neighbor, Sloan Herbick, standing outside on his front lawn. Behind him loomed his Victorian house, a blood-red building of sharp turrets and dark, dusty windows. Sloan Herbick was a strange man in more ways than one. He had been burned horribly as an infant in a crib fire, barely surviving with his life. Melted folds of lumpy scar tissue covered most of his body, including his face and head. Miraculously, he hadn't lost his eyesight, nose, or lips, but both of his ears were missing as well as all the hair on his head except his long, black eyelashes. His horrifyingly scarred body looked nearly as pale as an albino's, but his eyes were as dark as sin. I remembered Sloan as an arrogant, aloof man with no friends, about 10 years older than myself. According to what my mother told me as a teenager, Sloan's mother had gone missing when I was little, during the time when they were constructing our then brand new home in Frost Hollow. By now, I thought, he must be at least 40, though the keloid scars and mutilated ridges of flesh running over his entire body made it impossible to tell. As I got out of the car, I gave a neighborly wave, but Sloan ignored me. He stared fervently down at the hole, slamming the sharp tip of the shovel into the earth over and over again at a frenetic pace. I walked by Charlie's side up the rickety wooden steps to the front porch, pulling the spare house key out of my pocket from so many years ago. With trembling fingers, I slid the key into the lock, finding that my keys still worked, as I knew they would. The door opened onto a dark, sinister hallway. A nauseating odor emanated from the house, blowing out the front door like the rancid breath of some primordial monster. It was the smell of rotting bodies, clotted blood, and infection. It left a slightly sweet aftertaste. Gagging, I flipped on the light switch. I took a step forward, but Charlie didn't follow. He stared up at me with an unusual intensity, taking his huge, round arms and crossing them over his chest. The front of his dirt-caked sneakers came up the perimeter of the threshold, but he refused to go any further. He just shook his greasy, sweat-covered face. "Come on, buddy," I said encouragingly, giving him a wide smile. "What's wrong?" He pointed behind me, down the hallway. I instantly looked over my shoulder, my heart leaping up like a jackrabbit. Having watched far too many horror movies, I expected to see some blood street tags standing there with a face like a skull and an ear-to-ear grin. But the hallway lay empty. "She's still here," Charlie said slowly, his eyes giant glassy orbs of terror. "She is dead." "Mom's not here, buddy," I answered, ambling back toward him and taking one of his enormous hands in mine. I could feel the width of it, the smooth flatness of his palms except for one thick ridge. "Mom's at the funeral home. We're going to see her Sunday, remember?" Charlie shook his head again, his hair flying everywhere. "This place is bad," he said. "We've got to stay here for the weekend, Charlie," I responded, feeling a rising sense of irritation. "I already explained it all to you. The house is fine. They took the dead body out already, so what's the problem? You'll be with me the whole time." "It will be bad," Charlie said, sweating heavily. "It won't be scary, buddy. I promise." Looking back, it is hard to imagine any more untrue words than those. Much of the stuff from my mother's room had been taken out by the cleaning team. They told me that some of her fluids had burst from her body, staining the mattress and bed frame with their black rot. Luckily, not much had gotten on the floor, but a small puddle had dripped down. The guest bedroom was directly underneath Mom's room, just a small, square room on the first floor with a bed, a dresser, and a TV. I kept the bedside lamp on all night. On the ceiling of the room, there was a Rorschach-ink blot of dead, rotted fluids that still needed to be cleaned up. It was about the size of a basketball and looked like an eye. It had a dark, circular spot in the center, followed by thin, black tendrils that cracked their way towards the oval perimeter of the stain. Charlie crawled into bed next to me, putting a heavy, hot hand on my shoulder before falling asleep almost instantly. But I couldn't sleep. After what felt like an eternity, I looked over at the red lights of the alarm clock, seeing it was 3:32 a.m. I swore under my breath, sensing that my insomnia would not leave me alone this weekend in this place of horrors. At exactly 3:33, a jarring mechanical shrieking started outside. I jumped up in bed. Charlie awoke instantly. He sat up so fast that he smacked his head on the wall with a dull bank. "What the fuck is that noise?" I hissed, jumping out of bed. I looked up at the stain as I went, giving it a distrustful glance backwards. The mechanical caterwauling seemed to be growing louder as I made my way toward the front of the house. I went to the front window, seeing Sloan Herbeck running a wood chipper next to his totally dark house. I could just barely make out his dull silhouette, hearing the din of the constant grinding. Charlie gave an incomprehensible scream in the guest bedroom. I heard his heavy footsteps running toward me. His face was red and flushed, his pupils dilated and frantic. "The eye moved," he said, his voice having more emotion than I had heard in it in a long time. I blinked, the fog of sleep still clouding my mind. "You mean the stain?" I asked, finally figuring out what he was talking about. "The stain on the ceiling?" He nodded ferociously, bobbing his head up and down quickly. Eventually, I ended up talking Charlie down and getting him back to bed. The stain was still in the same spot, as far as I could tell. Around 4 a.m., the sound of the wood chipper finally died. In the eerie silence of the dark house, I fell into a nightmarish fever dream where I saw women bound with chains in a basement surrounding a mannequin wearing a suit made of human skin. The next morning, I went over to Sloane's house and knocked until he answered. While I waited, I studied the strange gargoyle knocker plastered across the scarlet door. At first, he would only crack it open a fraction of an inch, staring out at me with a single black eye. "Can you not run the wood chipper in the middle of the night?" I asked, giving him a faint, anxious half-smile. "It's keeping me and Charlie from sleeping." "I mean, you had the thing going at 3 a.m. last night." A few heartbeats later, the front door flew open. Sloan took a step towards me, until his scarred, alien face stood only inches from mine. "It's because of my skin, isn't it?" he asked in a hoarse, low voice. He spoke in a strange cadence, mumbling the words in dissonant rhythms. "If someone cut your eyes out so you couldn't see how ugly I am, you wouldn't care about the wood chipper anymore, would you?" I took a step back, the smile peeling off my face. I reached for the canister of police mace in my pocket, gripping it firmly and putting my hand on the trigger. "Sloan, that has nothing to do with that," I answered coldly, narrowing my eyes at him. "Don't act like a goddamn psycho. Look, if you keep that shit up, I'll call the cops. Don't fucking do it again." I had no patience for nut jobs like him. He always gave me the creeps. As a kid, someone had gone around pouring bleach into the eyes of people's cats and dogs, blinding them and leading to some getting euthanized. I always suspected Sloan of doing it, though he never got caught. My brother and I spent the rest of that day packing up anything we wanted to take with us, putting it in boxes and labeling it. Charlie didn't have a lot of possessions, and Mom didn't exactly have a lot of valuable items in her house, so it was fairly quick going. I figured I would either end up selling or donating most of the crap left behind in the end. Before I knew it, the sun had started setting again. The darkness of a moonless sky descended on Frost Hollow like a guillotine blade. My brother and I kept working, mostly in silence, though Charlie would come over and show me random objects he had recently acquired. "Rick," Charlie said, proudly holding up a plush doll of Rick from Rick and Morty. A trickle of fake drool dripped Rick's mouth, and a trickle of real one from Charlie's. I laughed, ruffling his hair as if he were a toddler. "That's right," I answered excitedly. "That's Rick." "You like Rick, buddy? You like how he just does whatever he wants whenever he feels like?" Charlie nodded excitedly at that. After a couple more hours of sorting, I decided to go to bed. I wanted to leave as early as possible on Sunday morning after the funeral, which was the next day. Charlie followed me like a puppy, his normally unfocused eyes flitting from one side to the other with a kind of intensity one had rarely seen there before. He constantly scanned the shadows, as if looking for something. We kept all the lights in the surrounding rooms and the guest bedroom. As I lay there, about to fall asleep, I glanced over at Charlie and saw him staring straight up at the stain with wide, watery eyes. I don't know how long it was later when I awoke suddenly in the pitch black. I blinked quickly, confused. And then I heard it, the noise that had caused me to sit up in bed. Right over me, I heard something gurgling and hissing in rhythmic breaths. It sounded as if whatever it was had lungs filled with blood and dirt. The terror I felt at that moment was incomprehensible. But it grew much worse when two burning, skeletal hands reached down and grabbed me. They covered my right arm in an iron grip, the thin, blade-like fingers feeling inhumanly long. I could feel my skin burning and melting. I screamed, kicking out with my legs and trying to pull away. I brought my left hand up, grabbing blindly for the thing's face. I groped in the darkness until I felt it, a face like a skull. It was slick and wet under my touch, sticky with clotted blood. I felt the muscles of its skeletal face thrumming and contracting. The thing had no skin. I repressed an urge to scream, instead reaching for its eyes, even as its burning hands continued yanking at my arm, trying to pull me off the bed. I felt a nose that was just a ragged hole of destroyed flesh, felt the fetid breath passing softly through those mutilated patches. I reached up into its eyes, but there were no eyes there, just two empty sockets. I reached inside and felt the skittering of insect larvae under my fingers. At the back of the empty socket, my fingers groped thin strands like fleshy wires that had been severed. With all of my strength, I stuck my finger deep down into that warm, twisting socket, stabbing my fingernails into the optic nerves and vessels at the back and ripping. The hands on my arm instantly released. I felt some of the melted skin go with them, heard the tearing of my flesh as warm blood instantly dripped from the wounds. Hyperventilating, my breath hissing with pain, I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter. I brought it up, flicking it. I caught a glimpse of the thing my brother called the bone-face woman, her naked, skeletal body running out of the room with a sickly gurgling of her diseased lungs. Overhead, the stain had turned into a real eye, a fleshy, black thing that flitted over the arm with a dilated pupil. It emanated insanity, its stare glassy and inhuman. Charlie lay on the floor, his eyes open but unseeing. My breath caught in my throat, the burning agony in my arm temporarily forgotten. I ran toward my brother, kneeling down over his limp body and shaking him. I saw fresh burn marks in the shape of a hand on his face, covering his forehead and temples. The cracked, broken flesh dribbled pus and blood like thick, clotted tears down his cheeks. When he didn't respond, I shook him again, grabbing him by the chin and forcing his eyes to meet mine. I saw him blink. He inhaled like a drowning man, grabbing my hand tightly and shaking his head from side to side. "She was here," he whispered. "She is dead, Dennis. She lives in the dirt. We need to get out of here and never come back," I said, trying to pull Charlie up. He was far too heavy. "Can you get up, buddy? Come on, we'll leave now." With great difficulty, Charlie pulled himself up. His eyes started watering as the weeping burn marks continuously dripped a rainbow of clotted fluids. I took out my phone, trying to call for help, but nothing was working in the house anymore. The electricity had gone off, which was why the lights had all gone out, but that wouldn't explain why my fully charged cell phone had gone black as well. Charlie and I stumbled outside. I put him in the passenger's seat of the car, deciding to get the hell out of there and never come back. But when I tried to turn the starter, the car didn't make a sound. The engine didn't even make an attempt to turn over. "It's her," Charlie whispered, his face a mask of terror and pain in the darkness. "The bone-face woman wants us to stay." "Well, she can go fuck herself," I spat, anger and fear mixing in a toxic sludge in my blood. I watched the house closely, seeing the curtains at the front moving. I caught an occasional glimpse of that abomination peeking out at us with her empty eye sockets and skinned face. I looked at Sloane's house, realizing I could call for help from there. He was the only neighbor within a half-mile radius. "Charlie, the car's not working and I need to call for help. I'm going to go across the street and use Sloane's phone to call the cops. I want you to lock yourself in the car. Don't open the door for anyone except me or the cops. You got that?" I asked, keeping a constant watch on the house, expecting the bone-face woman to slink out after us at any moment. "She is dead," Charlie said robotically. "She is walking. She will not let us leave." After I had made sure Charlie had locked himself in the car, I sprinted over to Sloane's dark Victorian house. I ran up the porch steps, ready to start knocking frantically on the door. But as soon as I touched it, it creaked slowly open, showing a dimly lit kitchen. A single oven light was turned on. I looked around in disgust. The place was filthy. Mold-covered pots and pans covered the stovetop. Drying crusts of filth covered a mountain of dishes emerging from the sink. Maggots and other insects feasted like kings here. The white reflections of glittering rat and mouse eyes peeked out at me from the corners of the room. "Sloane?" I called, not wanting to be too loud. Even though I wouldn't have admitted it to him, I was, quite honestly, terrified of Sloane Herbick. There was something off about that man. I left the kitchen, moving to the living room. There was only a single night light in here. All around me loomed naked human skins nailed to the wall. They rose in 2 rows, the bottom row offset from the top by a few feet so that more of the space could be used. I crept closer with wide eyes, realizing that the vast majority were just latex or silicone. Not all of them, however. Stuck randomly among the fake hanging skins were some that looked different. These looked thicker and had soft ridges running over their surface. I even saw signs of belly buttons, tattoos and nipples on these leathery skins. At that moment, I knew without a doubt that they were human. Many looked ancient and cracked, the leather falling apart at the shoulders or waist. There was a couch covered in what looked like gore in the center of the room facing a TV and DVD player. On a small, wooden table next to it lay a phone and a blood-encrusted meat cleaver. Shaking with excitement and fear, I crept closer to them, immediately grabbing the weapon. I took Sergeant Alvarez's card from my pocket, calling it. She answered on the second ring, sounding tired. "Hello," she said. "Sergeant Alvarez speaking." "This is Dennis Benton," I whispered furtively. "I need help immediately. Send an ambulance and police to my mother's house at 332 Angel Trace Road. Something's happened." "Where are you right now?" she asked. "I'm at my neighbor's across the street, but there's, body parts everywhere. I think he might be a serial killer. I don't know what the fuck's going on here, but please, hurry." I gently put the phone back down on the cradle, hearing a floorboard creak behind me. Sloan Herbick stood there, his dark eyes blazing. He pointed a pistol straight at my head. Looking down the barrel felt like looking into eternity. He was wearing a suit made of what looked like pale, white human skin. It covered him from head to foot, hugging his body with precision. All of the thread and sewing marks were expertly hidden. It almost made him look like some strange alien nudist, wearing a suit of white leather. At his feet, he had an open canister of gasoline. With practiced ease, he kicked it over, letting the pungent liquid spill out onto the floor all around me. "Hey man, you don't have to do this," I said, trying to act calm but quivering inside. I expected him to pull the trigger at any second, and then it would be lights out forever. "I've already started," he said, grinning and pointing out the window. I saw my house burning across the street. I felt the blood drain from my face as I thought about Charlie, sitting there in the car with his childlike innocence. I hoped he would know to get out in time. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, horrified. "I never did anything to you. Everyone who looked at me did something to me," he spat. "They hated me because I'm ugly and burned. But now I have a new skin, so people can't hate me anymore. I made it myself, and this face?" He pointed at the dried human skin wrapping around his head. "This is my mother's. She was one of my first, but she never truly left, you see. She told me, take it. This is my body, given to you. Take my skin, take my face and my hair, and from it, make yourself a new body. Make yourself a thing of beauty, as soft and pale as winter moonlight. After I killed her, I buried her under the dirt in your house, back when it was being built. I knew they would pour the foundation the next day. All those tons of concrete covered her, took her away, and then no one ever knew what happened." He shrugged. "It had to be done, to make me whole again. No mother could see her own son become a twisted, ugly thing, after all. The rest of the skin mostly came from prostitutes. I find female skin is much softer, more malleable, and easier to work with. They also take better care of their skin than men." He laughed softly at this. "Okay, so you've already finished your suit," I said, sweating heavily. "So let me go. I have nothing to do with this." He smiled an insane rictus grin behind his leathery mask. "I only need one more piece, and that is the soles of the feet," he answered in his cold, psychopathic way. "I'll get those from you. Goodbye, Dennis. It was nice seeing you again." At that moment, Charlie stumbled in the room, his movements loud and ungraceful. Sloan turned, surprised. A heartbeat later, Charlie slammed his heavy body against Sloan's back, sending him flying. The pistol went off, the bullet missing me by inches. I heard it whiz over the top of my head and smash into the ceiling above me. Cold dread worked its way down my spine as I realized I had just missed death by inches. Sloan landed on his stomach at Charlie's feet. Screaming, Sloan put his left hand up, revealing a Zippo lighter there. He flicked it, throwing it at the pile of gasoline. I backpedaled quickly, trying to go around the blazing ball of fire and get to Sloane. "Get the gun!" I screamed at Charlie. Charlie looked down at Sloane with slow comprehension dawning in his face. He took one massive sneaker and stomped down on Sloane's right hand with the pistol in it. I heard the bone crack like twigs snapping. Sloane shrieked, trying to pull away, but Charlie continued leaning down on his arm, preventing him from moving it. The fire was creeping at an incredible rate, rising up the walls and across the ceiling. Thick, black smoke filled the room, suffocating us. I ran at Charlie, my eyes watering. I realized I was still holding the meat cleaver in one hand. I looked down at Sloane in his suit of human skin, still trying to raise the gun with his broken arm. I wanted to finish this quickly. I brought the knife down into the back of his neck, hearing the bone crack. There was a wet thud and a bubbling of blood as the meat cleaver bit deeply into through his spine, and then Sloane was still. "Come on, Charlie," I said, grabbing his large hand. He wrapped his fingers around mine. Coughing and choking, we stumbled out into the night as police cars started pulling up. The first one had Sergeant Alvarez in it, who ran towards us, helping a stumbling Charlie toward the back seat of her car where he could sit down and catch his breath. Both houses were on fire now, blazing pillars of flame that rose high into the black, starless sky. At that moment, I only hoped that the flames would eat away the corpse of Sloane's mother, the bone-face woman. Bye and see you again in the next videos and stories.